Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to KEI for an August lunch break. I'm Jack Pritchard, the president of KEI. I want to tell you how we came to this program first. We're very excited about it. You know, KEI has for about 21 years or so hosted an academic symposium. We've been all over the United States, partnering with different universities from Harvard to UCLA to William and Mary, just lots of different places. But we came to the conclusion we weren't getting enough bang for the buck that we were putting into this. It was a great program, but we're not enough audience, in my opinion. We weren't getting enough out there, and so we were looking for ways to change that model. And we had a terrific idea from one of our former staff members that we are studies at their annual conference. They do it throughout the United States and North America, and in March of 2012 it will be in Toronto, Canada. It brings in 5,000 to 8,000 people. Those are professors, they are graduate students, they are people who are interested in Asian studies. So we have this past month been pulling together a program that we've now submitted 4 separate panels and 3 and 4 speakers each. And so that's what we're going to be doing next year. But the timing is a little off. We normally hold our academic symposium in September or October, as we did last year at American University. It went very well there. But when you have to go from October completing one and doing the work that's necessary to pull one off in March, wasn't going to work. You couldn't do that. There's just, as those of you who are involved in programming, work at other think tanks, you know the amount of work that goes into that, particularly when we're reaching out for 10 or 12 others from different institutions to write papers, to be speakers of that nature. So a second part of this brainchild idea was, what are we going to do this year that will fill the void? The idea was brought to us that we embraced, and that is doing a call for papers among the universities for graduate students and very bright undergraduate students, but with a little bit of a different twist. Rather than simply say, if you've got an idea and you'd like to write about it, tell us, and then we'll determine whether or not we're going to choose you. All these came via recommendations of university professors. So they've already been vetted, in a sense, by professors that have had a close association with these students. And we've ended up with 10 terrific presentations, papers, for which we've broken out into 3 separate events. Today is that first event. And today we're going to focus a little bit on emerging trends in North Korea. And we're a little excited about that. I think you're going to enjoy these 3 particular presentations. The format we're going to do is we're going to just briefly introduce individuals just simply by name, and then we're going to call them up one after the other to come up here. And you know, they're not sitting up here because we've got a presentation each of them are going to be making there. So I'm going to ask them to a little bit of a self-introduction, so you get to hear from them about themselves. After that, we're going to ask Dr. John Park, who is a senior program officer at the USIP, U.S. Institute for Peace. John, as you know, is an expert on Korean issues. He chairs a number of working groups and projects at USIP, one of which is the Korea Working Group. He's going to join us at the conclusion of the presentations to begin that discussion. And after he has got your intellectual juices motivated, we're going to open it up for some Q&A and allow you to talk to the folks involved here. But I've got to tell you, one of the things that why we're excited about that and why we've got a good turnout, and you see the mix of people in the audience, from young and some that used to be young, like me, is KEI is always looking for ways in which to promote the next generation of Korea watchers and scholars. And this has turned out to be just a terrific Emerging Voices Symposium, where we have been able to select some of the up-and-coming young scholars who, in a few years, if you continue to come to these programs, you're going to see them as members of the staff and at other institutions as well. So we're very excited about promoting that concept of passing on to the next generation opportunities to showcase their talents and their interests. So today, let me just briefly tell you the three programs or the three papers that you'll be listening to. Ian Reinhardt is going to start us off. He's at George Washington University. And his paper is entitled Nothing to be Afraid of, North Korea Political Economy and Economic Reform. He's going to be followed by Peter Nesbitt, who is going to be completing his BS at Georgetown this fall. His paper is entitled North Koreans Have Cell Phones, ? Why Cell Phones Won't Lead to Revolution and How They Strengthen the Regime. And then we're going to conclude with a very interesting paper by Jane Kim. It's entitled Selling North Korea in New Frontiers, Profit and Revolution in Cyberspace. I think you're going to enjoy the content and the presentation by each of these young scholars. So let me invite Ian to start us off. Thanks very much.
I'm in the Security Policy Studies program at George Washington University, Elliott School of International Affairs, and I'll be finishing my degree next spring. And I come to the study of Korea from a background in Japan studies, and actually I've been in Tokyo this summer interning with the State Department there, so if anything's a little off this afternoon, I'm going to beg jet lag, and thank you for your understanding. Is the volume okay back there? Yeah, okay, great. So my presentation is on North Korean political economy and economic reform, and I ask the question, nothing to be afraid of? And just start with a disclaimer: the opinion expressed in this presentation does not reflect in any way, shape, or form the official policy or position of my university, current and past employers, or any other organization, and this is all based on unclassified information. As a bit of context, you all know that socialist principles have guided the North Korean political economy since the country was established after World War II. The other guiding principle of North Korea is juche, usually translated as self-reliance. Not quite autarkic in the context of the economy, juche prescribes an emphasis on heavy industry and self-sufficiency in raw materials. Juche-inspired policies severely limited North Korea's economic growth by allocating scarce resources to unproductive industries. Although North Korea was successful through the 1970s, as other countries in East Asia experienced rapid economic growth and export-oriented development, North Korea fell further behind. During the 1980s, China and Vietnam, two Asian countries in the communist bloc, enacted wide-ranging economic reforms to pursue development by expanding trade with capitalist countries. In the post-Mao Zedong era, Chinese leaders have repeatedly encouraged North Korea to follow the China model and reform its state-controlled economy. In 2010, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao summarized this position saying, China will, as always, support North Korean efforts to develop its economy and improve its people's livelihoods, and is willing to introduce to North Korea the experience of China's reform and opening up and construction. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il have toured China numerous times and made statements praising China's achievements, but these visits have not led to any changes. Beginning in 1984, the joint venture law of the North Korean government took steps to encourage FDI, but they were half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful. I found that the aim of the free trade zones has been to capture external resources with as little reform and risk as possible. Now, in the late 1980s, we all know the economy slid into a decline compounded by the end of friendship pricing. In the mid-90s, they experienced economic collapse and one of the most destructive famines of the 20th century. And with the state unable to provide food, the breakdown led to small-scale social units, households, work units, party organs, etc., initiating entrepreneurial coping behavior, much of it technically illegal, to secure food. In 1998, the government revised the Constitution to expand the definition of private property and allow socialist cooperatives to conduct foreign trade. However, the changes barely affected reality on the ground. On July 1, 2002, the DPR-Gate government launched a reform program which decriminalized some of the coping behaviors. Again, the reforms are half-hearted and ultimately failed to provide for citizens' basic needs. After a good harvest in 2005, North Korean leadership began to roll back earlier reforms and attempted to reinstitute the public distribution system, or PDS. Since then, the DPRK has periodically cracked down on cross-border flows of people and goods, and in 2009 instituted a currency devaluation designed to wipe out private savings. So this is the context for the question of my paper. Despite the shining examples of South Korea and China, North Korea has repeatedly resisted economic reform. So I asked, why? Has North Korea opted not to, or failed to, reconfigure its political economy to take advantage of the benefits of a capitalist, market-oriented system? Is it that they're truly wedded to this socialist system, or is it they're more concerned about the political consequences? So here I list 7 possible explanations. One factor is the DPRK's government support for socialism and rejection of reform is that the top echelon of leaders is insulated from reality on the ground. Bruce Cummings writes, "The dear leader's problem is to be surrounded by sycophants telling him what they think he wants to hear, catering to his every whim, and no one who will tell him the truth." Sanctions are another disincentive for DPRK to increase foreign trade. Opening up the economy and investing in export industries carries the risk that importing countries will shut off trade in retaliation for provocative behavior. There's the less cynical view that North Korean leaders are genuinely convinced that their socialist system is superior to the alternatives. North Korea constantly blames external forces for its economic failures. Perhaps the current leadership merely believes that a more favorable external environment is all that needed to restore economic growth. Another explanation for resistance to reform, which in this case is nearly synonymous with increased foreign trade, is the Juche ideology of radical autonomy. Any economic reform that embraced capitalist principles would necessarily fly in the face of this long-cherished ideology. Beyond economics, the adoption of external ideas, advice, and aid wounds North Koreans' overdeveloped sense of national pride. A major thrust of foreign policy under Kim Il-sung was convincing the South Koreans that socialism is a superior system. So to give up on that goal is, in some sense, to admit defeat. North Korean leaders also feared that economic reform could open the door to absorption by South Korea or even China. Deep economic integration would lead to the dominance of the South Korean political economic system. Looking north from Pyongyang, it is possible to imagine that dependence on trade with China would lead to the DPRK becoming a de facto province of China. The presence of strong interest groups within the North Korean government and military also inhibits change to the status quo. The old guard of Kim Il-sung's generation are a group of conservative, largely military leaders who supported greater emphasis on military and defense spending, a focus on heavy industrial growth at the expense of consumer products, and a reduction of Chinese influence. After the growth of black markets in the 1990s, another interest group emerged, crony capitalists who profited handsomely from asset stripping, spontaneous privatization, and illicit trade in drugs, arms, and counterfeit US dollars. The DPRK regime's fear of losing political control is another prominent explanation for economic stagnation in North Korea. Central government officials are motivated by political liabilities associated with the reforms to date, including growing inequality, emergence of alternative centers of economic power, and the leakage of ideas and information as a result of increasing trade and investment. And the important point is that I'm not seeking to identify which one of these 7 is the factors, but to weigh the alternative explanations and see what is the balance of their explanatory power. So I'll go through them each individually and then summarize with a few policy recommendations. The ignorance of reality on the ground helped to preserve North Korea's centrally planned economy through the severe decline of the 1990s. The DPRK bureaucracy is plagued by poor information flow and compartmentalization. It seems likely that the systemic failures in the economy only became clear to top leaders gradually and long after the fact. Throughout the 1990s, economic policy adjustments were merely technical fixes. The July 1st reforms that decriminalized some coping mechanisms came 6 years after the famine peaked in 1996. It was in that year that Kim Jong-il said, "If the party lets the people solve the food problem themselves, then only the farmers and merchants will prosper." However, North Korean leaders could not have been completely blind to reality. Agricultural output in 2005 was roughly half of 1990 levels, and even the military was facing chronic shortages of food and fuel. The cumulative effect of economic sanctions on the DPRK political economy has been rather small compared to other factors analyzed in this section. Only the financial restrictions stemming from the Banco Delta Asia asset freeze appear to have had any significant effect. North Korea's international trade has grown every year since 1998, despite 3 UNSCR resolutions and other multilateral sanctions imposed as penalties for its nuclear program. Noland and Haggard find that the pattern of trade has simply shifted to countries that are uninterested in enforcing sanctions: China, South Korea under the Sunshine Policy, and some small and medium-sized Middle Eastern states. Countries that are inclined to participate in sanctions, such as Japan, have curtailed their economic ties. Despite its gestures toward trade and investment, the revised 1998 Constitution is thoroughly socialist. The DPRK's adherence to socialist policies is on some level, as I said, an existential issue. In a conversation with Erich Honecker in 1984, Kim Il-sung said, "If we leave China to the capitalists, there's the risk that China will become a quasi-colony again. What we are most afraid of is that China will not stick with socialism." The regime's initial reaction to the collapse of socialism in the USSR, for example, was unrepentant and open hostility to economic reform, which it interpreted as a fatal misstep of Soviet revisionism. Faced with less than damning evidence of decline, it would be natural for DPRK leaders to reject any radical changes to that status quo. However, in a 2001 speech, Kim Jong-il admitted that the socialist rationing policies of the past malfunctioned. Although the DPRK continues to trumpet socialism, it's now tempered. The state budget for 2010 says that North Korea will strictly adhere to the socialist principles in economic guidance and management, but later it qualifies that phrase with "on the principles of self-reliance and profitability." North Korea formed its national identity as a staunch member of the socialist communist bloc, eternally in opposition to the capitalist, or as they would say, imperialist camp. The competition between North and South Korea was in some sense an economic battle to build a more prosperous society. So to abandon socialism is to admit defeat. Thus, national dignity demands that DPRK continue to pursue socialist policies. However, despite its ubiquity in North Korean political and economic discourse, I find that the Juche ideology is closer to being a, quote, sham doctrine than the guiding principle of the country. B.R. Myers makes the convincing argument that Juche is vague enough and flexible enough to describe any policy that suits the North Korean government. If Kim Jong-il decided that he wanted to promote economic reform, he could find an interpretation and twist it to justify those policies. I love this picture. I don't know if anyone reads the blog, sort of Tumblr, Kim Jong-il looking at things. It's we have to take these issues seriously, but also sometimes they're just hilarious. The fear of absorption by its more prosperous neighbors is a powerful disincentive for North Korea to embrace a market-based economy. As I noted previously, abandoning socialism would reduce the DPRK to a poorer, backward version of the ROK. South Korea would surely assimilate the North Korea at some later date. In 1984, Kim Jong-il admitted in private that North Korea could not open up the country, as even the Chinese were urging, because, quote, it would be naturally tantamount to disarmament. The process of absorption by China is considerably different, but no less frightening to North Korean leaders. An estimated 80% of China DPRK trade takes place outside of state-to-state transfers. The regime's concern is that North Korean political economic system will come to be dominated by the dense business networks that include major Chinese and North Korean enterprises, smaller Chinese and North Korean businesses, and North Koreans with relatives in China. Absorption, it's not a matter of top-down control from Beijing, but rather I find that DPRK leaders feared that North Korea could be excessively dependent on the capitalist forces outside of the state-controlled socialist structure. The dramatic crackdown on border movements since 2007 provides evidence that this concern is real. State control of migration and economic flows is tied together with the desire of North Korean leadership to maintain the centralization of authority, and so that's very important. The influence of interest groups. Here I take a sort of a organizational perspective. In other words, organizational theory, you try to identify the interest groups within that are promoting or opposing reforms. So here I've identified on the left-hand side anti-reform elements, military is a bit of a question mark, and pro-reform elements. As I said, the influence of interest groups on economic reform is mixed because there are factions pulling in opposite directions. On one side are those elites entrenched in the central distribution system. They will support the status quo and measures to route more goods and resources through the existing distribution systems in order to accumulate bureaucratic power and presumably to enrich themselves. Partial reforms in communist systems can be highly distorting, favoring small groups of government-connected actors such as party cadres, government officials, military officials, and their families that subsequently become opponents of further reform. On the other side are those elites and emerging entrepreneurs that have benefited from the growth of markets in North Korea. Consumer goods traders without connection to government resources will promote reforms that expand the market for their products. Haggard and Nolan contend that the decline of the economy is so serious and the future so bleak that managers and workers at non-productive state-owned enterprises will not resist restructuring if only for the possibility of some employment. Now, the wild card in this issue, to me, is the military. Are high-ranking generals aiming to spur economic growth, or are they more interested in consolidating their position in the central planning apparatus? The top leadership benefits from the foreign exchange generated in arms sales, and the Songun policy largely insulates the military from deprivations brought on by economic inefficiency. The government agencies that direct foreign investment in North Korea were recently consolidated into a single agency under the guidance of Chang Sung-taek, suggesting that military leadership is not in favor of reforms that reduce the role of the state in the economy. Excuse me. Lastly, we come to political control. I find that the strongest factor in resisting economic reform in North Korea has been the desire of the Kim regime to maintain strong centralized political control. And here you can see exactly the sort of fears that they might have in mind as a picture of Tahrir Square in Egypt this spring. The monolithic structure of the North Korean state subordinates economics to politics. The system is designed so that no major program or project can move forward without approval from top leadership. Under the comparatively decentralized entrepreneurial environment of the 1990s and early 2000s, the regime saw power ebbing away from the center. Even the July 1st reforms could be considered efforts to reassert central authority. The granting of some managerial autonomy to SOEs and price incentives to farmers were efforts to coax economic activity from the market back into state-controlled entities and channels. And the tax and financial reforms clearly reflected the declining ability of the state to access resources through the planning process. And some reforms were motivated in part by efforts to reestablish control. The 2009 currency revaluation and the 2005 attempt to fully reestablish the PDS were aimed at eliminating the class of black market traders. The spread of village markets, legal and illegal, creates opportunities for merchants with no allegiance to the Kim regime to become wealthy. A major political economic strategy of the North Korean government is to stunt the development of political challengers. Leadership naturally wants to quash the most prevalent organization, the village market, that exists independent of Korean Workers' Party oversight. The episodic crackdowns on consumer goods provide another indication that the government is concerned about the potential for economic opening to undermine its authority. Strict oversight of workers in the Kaesong complex, increased punishments for border crossing, banning private use of mobile phones in 2004, and seizures of contraband South Korean media are implicit evidence of these concerns. Although, as we'll hear later, with Korea is expanding its mobile phone network, the government has shown extreme sensitivity to the spread of information about the outside world. DPRK is highly conscious of the fate of European socialist countries after reform and opening. A 2007 KINU report states, even though the North Korean government is fully aware of the need for opening, it does not pursue more than economic recovery in order to avoid any internal confusion and insecurity. Economic liberalization creates more space for competing power centers to emerge, not only in general society, but also within the elite, which represents a more proximate threat to Kim Jong-il and his apparent successor, Kim Jong-un. Pro-market economic reforms would have the dual consequence of, one, reducing the resources that can be funneled to elites through patronage, and two, providing opportunities for entrepreneurial factor managers or military officials to develop independent sources of wealth and political power. I'll get a few minutes left, right? Okay, great. I'll just add that many of these factors tie together in inextricable ways. The important point is that the existence of multiple factors compounds the incentives to resist the marketization of the economy. Though the concern for political unrest appears to be the strongest explanation, it is important to remember that all these factors mutually reinforce each other. So here I have a few policy recommendations. I find that U.S. policy towards North Korea is often dominated by hard power considerations, nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, torpedo attacks, etc. This paper sets aside the hard power dynamics and asks instead, how can we use the conclusions to shape soft power policies towards North Korea? North Korean leadership's fear of outside influences and subversion from below indicates that soft power has the potential to produce change favorable to the U.S. It can contribute to U.S. goals in two ways. The first is through the promotion of human rights, and second, the soft power approach can contribute to the stability of the Korean Peninsula by fostering a political economic system that is less inclined to belligerent provocations. Policies that promote political and economic liberalization will reduce the likelihood of conflict in the long run. So in IR theory terms, I'm advancing a liberal institutionalist argument. One promising tactic is to pressure China on refoulement of North Korean refugees. Another policy recommendation is promotion of pro-democracy, pro-capitalist elements within North Korea. Visible civil society organizations are basically doomed to failure, but looser, more informal coalitions could spring up in the right situation. Haggard and Nolan hopefully suggest that party cadres, firm managers, and low-ranking military officers may provide the political foundation for the competitive liberalization and reform from below that took place in China and Vietnam. So the role of U.S. policy might be to foster any of these green shoots of reform, tailor sanctions to shield pro-reform elements, work with DPRK agencies that have a reputation for openness, and engage on multiple levels to promote pluralism and collectivism within North Korean policymaking. China, too, could play a constructive role in this process by convincing North Korean leaders that it will preserve the ruling regime against challenges from below. The DPRK might be more willing to experiment with economic reform if it thinks that its political control is not threatened by expanding foreign trade and market-based commerce. So the goal is to foster a more pluralistic political economy, which can only be achieved gradually. And I'll conclude by identifying two contradictions arising from the above policy recommendations. The first is, how can we support these liberal elements without tarnishing them? As you all know, xenophobia and anti-Americanism is a major element in North Korean political life, so how can we contribute to civil society without discrediting the very organizations that we seek to help? And then the second contradiction, which I think will come out throughout today and hopefully in future sessions, is that marketization is happening whether the regime likes it or not, and it's coming up from the bottom. Noland and Haggard say that more than 2/3 of respondents, defectors, report that half or more of their income came from private business activities, and more than half of urban residents reported purchasing at least 75% of their food in the market. And I guess we're going to do questions later, but here's my email address. If you'd like to contact me, please do so, and I'll leave you with that picture of King Jong-il examining those watermelons.
My name is Peter Nesbitt. I'm a rising senior at Georgetown University studying international politics, focusing on security studies. Before Georgetown, I was in the Army for 6 years, learned Korean at the Defense Language Institute, and spent about 3 years in South Korea. First of all, I'd like to thank KEI providing this forum for us to present these papers today, and also thank Professor Victor Cha for recommending me in the first place to present this paper. I'd like to first kind of give a roadmap of where we're going in terms of where the basis of my research is. This paper is about, this kind of question is like, North Koreans have cell phones, and most people, at least on face value, would think cell phones promote some sort of revolution or social disorder. But this paper looks at the flip side of that and how actually cell phones can actually promote social control and surveillance within a regime. So much of the discussion of current research is just the mere fact that North Koreans do have cell phones. That's great, but it doesn't really provide us, any sort of policy recommendations of what we should be doing with that knowledge. So with that, I just want to start with basically 3 schools of thought that generally follow the typical North Korean views or views on North Korea, whether they be based on ideology or international relations theory. The first would be that North Korea is seeking to open up to the outside world, and that's why they want to have cell phones. Second is they have no choice but to retroactively support the status quo. And third, it's all about the economy. When dealing with the first, there's many scholars who say that it's just their way of reaching out to the international community in order to, as maybe an olive branch, in order to promote trade relations or other sorts of economic goods, or get other sorts of economic goods in the deal. The problem with this view is, at the same time that they were introducing cell phones, they were also having a series of provocations, such as the bombing or the sinking of the Chonan or the bombing of Yongpyong Island. So this doesn't really answer, or this doesn't provide good guidance in terms of why North Korea decided to introduce cell phones at this moment in, say, 2008. A second view would be that many scholars think that, say, North Korea is maybe on the verge of collapse or maybe losing significant control. We don't really know exactly whether they're in the midst of a famine or not. But at the same time, that if that's the case, it could be very similar to the markets. As Ian mentioned, that after the markets were already introduced, they basically had to retroactively legalize them and provide some sort of conduit for them. But in the sense that where cell phones have the potential for revolutionary disorder, that it actually demonstrates the regime's strength rather than their weakness, more likely. That they actually feel comfortable enough to introduce this sort of technology into their society, that they think they can manage this technology. So this school of thought also does not really answer why North Korea has cell phones right now. The final school of thought is more about the economy, and I think there's probably a little more to be said about this, in terms of that it could be a form of foreign direct investment. As you see with Rascom, we'll talk about in a moment, about how they're providing lots of hard currency to the country. Also for the foreigners to be paying for these cell phone contracts, whether it be think tanks or academics going there to need cell phones, or businessmen that provide also hard currency for the regime. And more importantly, could demonstrate wealth to the elite, and it's to demonstrate for the upcoming strong and prosperous nation in 2012 one of these hard economic goods that the regime has promised, whether it be 10,000 apartments in Pyongyang or a numerous set of roads or other sort of economic targets. But the problem with that, this idea as well, is that if there's other economic goods they could have promised. Why cell phones, when it, again, on face, has the potential for revolution? So before we really get an answer of why it is cell phones, or looking at that, we need to have an understanding of what's North Korea's relationship with cell phones and telecommunications in the past. They were first introduced in the free economic zones in the late 1990s. As most people know, that the North Korean infrastructure is rather decrepit at all levels, whether it be roads or trains or telecommunications. Well, with the fate of the free economic zones, it was also the fate of these cell phone companies, and they did not prosper very well. But by 2003, a couple companies had rolled out a cell phone network in Pyongyang at about 40,000 subscribers. But abruptly, they were banned in 2004. There were many reasons cited in public media for this. It might be the Ryongcheon train disaster, and it was as cited as a potential cell phone detonated device on a train. Well, this hypothesis has largely been discredited. It was more likely that it was the introduction of Chinese cell phone towers on the North Korean border that threatened the regime. As North Korean citizens, when had these Chinese cell phones, it was hard for the North Korean regime to actually manage cell phones abroad, and they overreacted by banning all cell phones. But by 2008, a Rascom was able to convince the regime that they should actually reintroduce cell phones, and this would be a 3G network. And along with this deal would come the opportunity for a Rascom to help rebuild the Sangwon cement plant, and additionally, almost complete now the Ryugyong Hotel, the iconic Ryugyong Hotel in downtown Pyongyang. And so this is where they are now today, with most recently 500,000 subscribers throughout North Korea and an ever-expanding cell phone network with more towers and more subscribers every month. So as North Korea has brought in more cell phones, it needs to understand exactly how they're going to be used in North Korea and how they're being used today. And there's several theories that go along with that. The first would be technological determinism. This is the idea that because kids have video games, they're violent. But on the flip side of that, it could be the other way around, that it's the fact that there's violence in society that causes violent video games. So it determines of whether the technology is determining the societal behavior or vice versa. Another theory is in terms of affordance. This is more an understanding of how different age groups and different cultures adapt to technology at the same time. So you can think of, say, compare South Korean children to American children and their use of SMS technology with their text messages. Or compare, even with this room, people under 30 and people over 30 in terms of how they use their cell phones. That's the understanding that it's not just about whether it's technology or whether it's society, but different age groups and different cultures interact with technology differently. The final theory of how cell phones or how technology itself is adapted within culture is called domestication. And in this way, this is how, as I say, a North Korean purchases a cell phone to the point they learn how to use it, to the point they master it, the nature of the cell phone itself differs. Think of the iPad when it was first introduced. No one really knew exactly how to use it. But as people were introduced into our own daily lives, we found uses for it, and it's since taken off. In the same way in North Korea as well, there might not be immediate applications today that they'll find more uses for as it goes along. So along with the more common understood ways of communication information, in many other countries and developing countries, cell phones are used for crop prices, weather information, potential buyers, the price of rice, let's say, in the market. It's also going to reflect the owner's personality in terms of how they use it and how they identify with it themselves. Cell phones, unlike landlines, are part of an individual. When I call a phone a landline, I'm calling a place. When I'm calling a cell phone, I'm calling a person. And so it really changes the dynamic of how technology is used and how we communicate overall. And because of that, that brings to who actually is using the cell phones. So we see that the cell phones are going to be used in some very unique ways, and those ways are going to change over time in North Korea. But it's important to understand which interest groups were promoting the introduction of cell phones, and are at least going to benefit the most from these cell phones in North Korea. Most importantly, with everything, especially with the Songun Jongchi, or the military first policy, it'll be the military is going to benefit the most. Not only as a backup communication device to their already pre-existing networks, the military has expanded deeply into enterprise activities to earn hard currency. Just like cell phones anywhere else, where it helps that micro coordination, that finishing that last 50 meters, where to put these 5 bags of rice. That's exactly what a cell phone will be used for the military in their economic endeavors, and it'll help them improve their efficiency and their coordination in terms of whether it be military related or economic related. Beyond that, the other elite in North Korea will also benefit. As North Korea has promised to be a strong and prosperous nation by 2012, they've promised explicit economic goals to that end. And one of the most obvious consumer items, not only within North Korea, but in almost every other developing country, has been a cell phone, as a means not only to communicate, but as a form of identity that demonstrates that they've actually attained a certain level of wealth, and this will help demonstrate to the elite to demonstrate to themselves and others that they've actually attained this level of wealth. A third group who will benefit will be not only NGOs, but also businessmen and academics who travel to North Korea. They're the ones who may be paying the expensive contract fees and expensive monthly rate fees in order to fuel the hard currency into the regime. And the final group will be the emerging new rich, especially near the markets, especially near the Chinese border. Right now, they're using the illicit Chinese cell phones and having the risk of arrest and imprisonment, and it'd be easier for them to switch over to a North Korean cell phone without that risk. So that provides who's actually going to use the cell phones. And so not only it's going to be the military and the elite, but it also might be NGOs and other workers as well. And these provide the opportunity for North Korea to increase surveillance and social control in several unique ways. As I mentioned, unlike landlines, cell phones are an intimate part of an individual. And because of that, the intimacy carries on to conversation. Much of the sociological research about cell phones is about how conversations and communication with them is actually fundamentally different than it is through other means. And because of that, it's a different look into the daily lives of North Koreans. As of 1997, there was reports of 30,000 special police specifically dedicated to monitoring communications and emails and normal mail. Certainly with the expansion of cell phones, that number of individuals has increased. And so if you think of how a cell phone works, often they'll have GPS. Not only if they don't have GPS, it doesn't matter. They'll be able to use triangulation of cell phone towers to determine where an individual's at. So they find some sort of dissident behavior, some sort of political behavior that they don't agree with, that being the North Korean authorities. They'll be able to find where that person's at, when they communicated, who they communicated to, and their networks. Just like law enforcement agencies use today, or the FBI or the military in their war on terrorism, they'll take that cell phone and all those contacts and find out who they are and monitor them as well. They'll be using the same social network analysis tools that the local DC police department uses in order to ferret out, say, a gang, they'll be able to ferret out some sort of dissident network or network of corruption within North Korea. So in cell phones, on the other hand, instead of providing a means of revolution, can provide a means of social control and surveillance. As a RASCOM, the Egyptian conglomerate that's providing the cell phones, certainly probably had to answer many questions about this potential for revolution with the Egyptian revolution. And the answer to that is very simple. The cell phone ownership in Egypt was 78% for among the youth between 20 and 30 years old. In North Korea, the youth are already one of the most moderate groups on college campuses, within the North Korean elite society. The second is that while in Egypt, the public place was highly monitored, the private place was not, and fairly unregulated. With the cell phone providers, they'll be able to monitor that private area as well. And so this is fundamentally why, at least my research directed towards that it's North Korea's comfortableness with the technology itself and understanding its possibilities in terms of monitoring and surveilling their own people that allows them to feel comfortable introducing the technology in the first place. So if this is the reason why they introduced cell phones, there's likelihood that they could still go back to be banned, just like in 2004. But that would only because they've either overestimated their comfortableness with the technology, or some other key event will cause will lead them to overreact. Or more importantly for U.S. policymakers is to really think about what this could be used, how we can use their cell phones in our purposes. One of the keys is to increase funding for understanding how to collect on these cell phones within North Korea. A second is understanding, incorporating this understanding of cell phones into our operation plans and our contingency plans, whether it be in terms of a North Korean invasion or some sort of other social disorder within North Korea or humanitarian crisis. Think of the possibilities of what we could do if we could send a text message to every single North Korean who has a cell phone in the moment of social disorder in North Korea. That's the kind of technology we need to be thinking about in terms of policy implications of North Korean cell phones, and that's the direction we need to be thinking of what we could use it for in terms of our own information operations, our own intelligence collection and intelligence services. So with that, the answer to why North Korea has cell phones and why now is certainly a variety of reasons, but most importantly, it's their understanding of the technology and how they can use it for their own control of their own citizens, and the lack of concern of control of others. Because the fundamental part is, while cell phones might facilitate revolutions, they don't create revolutions. They don't create the social movements that those cell phones would use. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As I start, I'd like to thank KEI for the opportunity to present my paper today. And our professors at USKI, the Korea Studies program at SAIS. And I'd also like to thank my supervisor at WorkNat, who's been very supportive in this paper. I come from a background in human rights and refugee-related work, and I just, like most of you probably, am what I'd like to consider a North Korea junkie. And so I read up on North Korea once in a while. And what I noticed recently is that North Korea is doing a lot of various things online. If you look, they've been opening Twitter and YouTube accounts. They've started putting websites at the .kp address, hosted on a server in Pyongyang. And the websites themselves look aesthetically different. They look more modern, and they resemble a lot of other news agency websites. So I wondered the question, what is North Korea up to? And we know that North Korea currently economically is in a very dire situation, needing a lot of hard currency. They've been left behind sort of in the international knowledge transfer that's been going on. And they've been pushing and talking a lot about, been a lot of rhetoric about, this great and prosperous nation in 2012 and how they're going to improve the lives of their people. And we know politically they're going through a succession right now, and there is a serious need for some sort of legitimizing reason to bring Kim Jong-un into power. So all of these things, the question, we ask the question, what's going on with internet in North Korea. And so if we look at the debate of cyberspace in North Korea, we realize there are obviously benefits and also concerns. If we look at the incentives, it's really basically access to information and access to foreign currency. If you look at the information, the internet will basically give North Korea the opportunity to really single leap and frog leap into modernization. And foreign currency, as we know, through e-commerce and investment, they're trying to attract a lot of foreign investors through the internet. But the concerns, obviously, if they outweigh the benefits, then this would not be something North Korea would pursue. And the main concern, one of the concerns is the limited infrastructure capacity because of North Korea's limited capital. But the main concern is that this could potentially lead to regime instability. And this being said, with radio, a lot of the North Koreans, when they listen to radio, are something of a passive information recipient. But if the internet is opened to North Koreans, then at the same time, they become more proactive in seeking out the information that they want. And so in calculating this cost-benefit analysis, we would guess that North Korea would only proceed with connecting to the internet if, first, there were adequate and successful measures of control, and secondly, if there is some sort of added value for the decision-making bodies in North Korea. So this first part about the measures of control, I feel that through my research, you can see that there are internal measures of control in place. For example, just the general science and technology policy is one that a researcher found to be vertical consolidation and horizontal restriction. And just by virtue of the social hierarchies inside North Korea and who's considered loyal enough to access certain material, that in and of itself is a control mechanism. And secondly, Kim Hung-kwang, who is a defector and a former professor, computer science professor in North Korea, had mentioned that the mosquito net is something that North Korea has applied, which attempts to attract the inflow of foreign investment while simultaneously blocking infiltrations of foreign ideas, news, and culture. And he also presents some of the three strategies, if you guys can see it, that the three major institutions, computer-related institutions, came up with regarding this sort of filtering and control mechanisms. And secondly, as far as this added value, the decision-making bodies, McEachern says, are three: the Korean Workers' Party, the Army, and also the cabinet. So what if we look at what they can benefit, when we look at the Workers' Party, we find a new territory for this ideological revolution, something of a fourth revolution that can be added to Kim Il-sung's three revolutions at home, in the South, and in the world. So the cyberspace presents this fourth revolution. For the military, while this presents a huge threat, it also at the same time affirms their importance and gives them an opportunity to really advance their electronic warfare. Lastly, for the cabinet, it presents opportunities to make profit and at the same time improve the image of North Korea. So, given that these two things are there, we would say connect. So if we look at what North Korea has been doing domestically, we can see that it first began to make some sort of network in the 1990s. The first domestic network was among the about 100 institutions, and they were connected originally by phone lines and then later through fiber optic cables in the late 1990s. Those were probably provided by the UNDP-sponsored fiber optic cable factory. And in the 2000s, it connected further out into major cities by 2000. And then in 2003, the network was connected to the city and district level. And so they say that the implications of this network were that they allowed a lot more information transfer between Pyongyang and the rest of the regions. And so it allowed scientists to not have, it saved them the travel time to go to Pyongyang and accessing all these technical data. Secondly, in the 2000s, Kwangmyeong, their intranet, was created. It was developed by CIAS, the Central Intelligence Agency for Science and Technology, and completed for public use in 2002, November of 2002. And it connects over, they say, 13,000 institutions. And some of its features is it has news, an email service, messenger program, file transfer options, and document search engines. And this allows unprecedented information exchange in North Korea. Now, getting connected to the World Wide Web, we see that North Korea its main institutions in Pyongyang were actually connected to the internet via servers in China by 2000. However, and in 2001, we see that North Korea signals some sort of intent to be more active online by registering with SWIFT, which is an organization that provides services for secure financial transactions. And if we look at some of the first websites that North Korea had, there are some differing opinions, but these are sort of the generally accepted. We have KCNA, the one in Japan that opened in 97. Korea Info Bank in 99, which was focused actually on bringing in economic profit. And Shili Bank, which offered the first international email service to North Korea. It was originally once a day and then later became a 24-hour email service. And if you look at the institutions that are involved in this endeavor, you see there are a whole, range of organizations that range from government to academic institutions and to some businesses. The ones that are highlighted in green, I don't know if you can quite see it, but the ones in green are said to have more than 100 employees. But the main one, the largest computer company would be the Korea Computer Center, the KCC. And formed in 1990, it has more than 1,000 employees, 2,500 computers, and is ISO 9001 certified, which means they are certified according to certain quality control standards of an international standard. And they have regional branches in each province and some overseas branches that range from China to Germany to the Arab Emirates. And their function is to work on the research and development, distribution, and service of software, train specialists at their KCC Information Technology College and Information Technology Institute, manage some of the websites that North Korea has, and import and sales of hardware, IT policy, and resource consulting. So if you look here, you can see 10 of the centers that are affiliated with the KCC and sort of their focus areas. This is something that I sort of put together, but I don't quite know what Pugunbyeol IT Center does. But all of these centers actually have their own quality control centers. And as far as like the artificial intelligence at the Samilpo IT Center, it is said to be actually to be of very high quality. Now, so given this connection, if we look at sort of the trends in internet activities, I saw a couple things. First, I saw that there's increasing presence and autonomy online. So there's been a proliferation of these official North Korean websites that have been moved to the server in Pyongyang, and in addition are at the .kp address. And secondly, we can see an increase in technical sophistication and modernization of these North Korean websites. Before, you couldn't see photos really of any very good quality or videos, but now you can actually view them through embedded players on the websites directly. And you can see that there's sort of a strategy that North Korea is using to improve their own image through this sort of modernization and makeover of their websites. And, for example, they mention in their Yeomyeong website that it's actually viewable on mobile phones inside the country. The third one that I see is that there are serious efforts being made to secure profits through online activities. And this is generally through attracting foreign investment, selling products, and drawing tourists. Granted, they've been limited in their success, but you do see a lot of effort being made. So this was the website on Yeomyeong that advertises their connection. And so as far as this their economic activities online, I think there are two main strategies. One is to sell ideology and goods, and secondly is to sort of segment and target your customer base according to their purchasing power. So firstly, for small-scale purchases made by individuals, it's generally to sell ideology, goods, and products. Investors making large-scale purchases, it would be more for these, investment opportunities, which I guess you could call also goods and products. So for these individuals, if you look, ideology that they're selling, you see a lot of engagement in social media these days. Twitter, they have more than 11,000 followers, and they put out really, what would be the right word? Kind of hip little responses to some of the things that people post. And so there's this sort of engagement at the social level. And at this, and also at the Korea Friendship Association website, you can also see that you can sign up for membership in their organization. And not only that, if you really want, you can get a membership card shipped to you for $50, if anyone's interested. And some of the products that they've been selling online include tours, DVDs, music, CDs, postcard stamps, books, photos, some postcards of Kim Jong-il looking at things on the bottom. As far as investors and firms, we see generally that North Korea is trying to promote the country as the safe and secure investment environment. And largely it does this by advertising four things. It's large economic incentives, low tax schemes in Asia, highly skilled and motivated but low-wage labor, sound institutional support through this hub organization, the IKBC, and this legal system where there is no corruption and these great FDI laws. And this actually website is one that I just put up as an example that sort of implements these strategies. KoreaDPR.com is actually the Korea Friendship Association, which is affiliated with the organization with North Korea, but is not officially a government entity. But so this was originally the website in March 2001. It started with this page on the top left, and then it went to the page of the great leader and the dear leader on the right, and then went to this page. It was not very user-friendly. And then this was in April 2011. So 10 years later, it became a much more modern and user-friendly website. And if you look at the evolution of the products that they sell on this website, first there were only a couple products that were sold directly on the website. I think it was about 2 products that were like stamps and a CD, a music CD. But then later on, it became 2 external websites. And you can see on the bottom here, through a tracking device, I was able to look at the website in its former stages. And you can see sort of an increase in the number of designs and some sort of price fluctuation. As far as attracting investment, you can also see that in 2001, they actually had no business information available on the website. Then in 2002, there was some sort of PRing of joint business ventures in DPRK. And then in 2008 is when really there was a big change in the business page with more detailed information. And in 2011, you can see increased details about certain industries that you can invest in. And the bottom is actually one of some information from that. And so some takeaways, well, first off, this is by no means, the answer or comprehensive in any way. But firstly, I think this shows that North Korea understands how to navigate in a new system according to international standards. So they know that a safe and secure investment environment requires certain things. And they know that if they have a more modern looking website, that this means something. And free market principles, it also shows that they're supplying what is demanded, this low wage labor that they know can be cheaper than China, what this means in the international community. Secondly, it shows that online capacity has increased nationally and also for individuals. So there have been more reports about how individuals are having access to the internet. But I mean, aside from that, we see that at the national level, it's connected in a nationwide, the entire nation is connected in a network. And also that individuals can actually access and the intranet through something like the first internet cafe run by the Cheomdan Technology Center. It's near the Gwangbok subway station and holds about 100 computers. And apparently, after class from 3 to 7, it's bustling with people. So it shows that there's more use going on inside the country. Thirdly, it shows that DPRK has benefited from this knowledge sharing. For example, through the free operating system Linux, they were able to make their first indigenous operating system, 붉은별, which is Red Star. They've also been able to tap into some of the scientific databases that are available online. And so they've been able to benefit that way. Fourth, it shows that this is something that they're going to pursue into the future. And this will only result in increased cyber technology measures, as well as cyber terrorism, as that becomes more robust. And fifth, though it is struggling, I would like to think that North Korea is doing reasonably well, given its constraints to increase competitiveness in the international market. So given all the caveats and the constraints that North Korea faces, I think it's developing some sort of strategy, which I don't think is bad. And so the first strategy you see is to utilize open source information. Second, to discover a comparative advantage and find a demand for it. Third, set multiple layers of security control mechanisms and always have a two-prong approach. Sell ideology, go for profits, also have your internal mechanism of control, but as well as like a filtering system for your internet, etc. And so I leave with this last slide, which is questions about the future. If North Korea is beginning to really, really push economic profit through these means, then how will North Korea begin to emphasize certain industries and sort of market itself? And secondly, pursuit of hard currency, is that really going to be a greater incentive than ideological revolution? And cyber terrorism, we hear lots of reports now. And what does this mean? Will this continue to rise in the future? And if so, in what capacity? Fourth, North Korea's internet and its role with Kim Jong-un's legitimacy. And lastly, this internet and intranet nexus and the internet's evolution into the future. What do these things mean? And I think these are things we'll probably have to look for in the future. Thank you.
First off, join me in another round of applause for our three speakers. I thought their papers were excellent. First, I really have to commend KEI for doing this. It is so important to cultivate the next generation of career watchers. And these are topics that I think certainly are in the early trends of going up. So this is a generation that can track these areas and in their own mind, in their own ways, own these fields and disciplines, because it really is new ground. I wanted to give very brief comments so that we can leave enough time for Q&A. But in the order of the paper presenters, just wanted to add some additional points based on some of the research that we've been doing here in Washington as well as out in the field. And these are topics that really are, I think, at the edge, the cutting edge of a lot of the research on North Korea. Looking at Ian's paper, Nothing to be Afraid of, DPRK efforts on economic reform, the one theme that comes out a lot in terms of our research with defectors who are still in commercial contact with their relatives and contacts on the North Korean side, still engaged in commercial activity, is this notion that Juche is alive in North Korea, but on an individual basis, where everyone is doing well almost as a self-employed entrepreneur in these informal markets. So when you do look at some of the phenomena in North Korea, Ian ends with the slide on contradictions. There are a tremendous amount of contradictions in North Korea right now. And what may seem rational and causal in terms of A leading into B, in many respects is coincidental, but other factors that are legacy issues feeding in and hitting a culmination point and new stimulus coming into the picture here. But when we look at it from the top-down economic reform, I would say that many people are pessimistic. And out of everyone that I've been interviewing over the years, the most pessimistic are actually the Chinese. So in the propaganda, we hear the Chinese encouraging the North Koreans to do Chinese-style economic reform. But in actuality, if you look at the structure of these joint economic development projects along the border area and what the Chinese are doing, I'm cognizant that Afghanistan and North Korea are completely different cases. But in some instances, what the Chinese are doing, they look like provincial reconstruction teams. They're drawing in the capital and the investment. They're drawing in the managerial expertise from the Chinese side, and they're running these economic development zones. The hope is eventually the North Korean partners will be able to learn some of these skill sets, do some capacity building, and eventually run some of these sites. So this is really an experiment on the Chinese side, but really one that's painted in propaganda, but in practice very much hands-on on the Chinese side. So this leads us to the bottom-up transformations, and Ian talks about these, and specifically from the perspective of coping mechanisms. That certainly is true, but I think one of the early views was that it was a coping mechanism for North Korean citizens, the average North Korean person who has really no other means but to rely on his or her own capabilities to make ends meet. But what we're finding more and more is that North Korean officials, party officials, members of the military, they're as involved in the informal markets as anyone else. So I think one way that we view the informal markets now is that it's an organic mechanism that is growing and evolving. In some cases, a few steps back, in some cases, a few steps forward, but it's very much an organism unto itself. And this is something I think where we've already departed from the point of no return in terms of government control or manipulation of the informal markets. Now, with this, the primary question of why North Korea has not adopted economic reform, if we zero in on this bottom-up phenomenon, the informal markets, I think there are some rich questions to follow up on, and these are very operational, and we move away from ideology. So how is money made in North Korea right now? If you look at the informal markets, there are some pieces that you can put together because everything in the informal markets is transactional, and at some point there's a Chinese partner. So if you do mirrored statistics, and if you look at the wholesale activity on the Chinese side, retail side activity on the North Korean, and also whatever is cultivated or harvested on the North Korean side, sold on the Chinese side. There's a vibrant border activity going on. So that is a new phenomenon that gives us new insights on the research. But also in this type of transaction, who are the winners, who are the losers? There are also partners, and the partners, I think, are very important when you look at the next stage of evolution of this organism. These are not static relationships, and the fact that they're driven by profit, I think, gives us a new angle to look at this phenomena. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that North Korea has mastered the technique of being the recipient of bailouts. Neighboring countries have taken turns bailing out the North Koreans, and that has led to a certain pattern of behavior on the North Korean side, and frankly, in some cases, the impediments to the development of certain capabilities. If you're going to be on the edge of collapse and you know a country and someone's going to bail you out because of the concerns of the uncertainty that your demise has over that country, that's a tremendous leverage that you have on neighboring countries. But the other thing as we think about this pattern of becoming accustomed to bailouts is also the need to look at North Korea as a two-tier economy. Under Kim Il-sung, North Korea really was a contiguous one-party state. There were privileged elites, the cadre were at the top, but it was still one system. Under Kim Jong-il, what defectors pieced together, and these are defectors who used to work in North Korean state trading companies and who've seen the money flow and how the changes have occurred over time. What they note now is that under Kim Jong-il, there's a two-tier economy. One is the general economy, where we hear about the frequent reports of food scarcity issues, and the royal court economy, where the state trading companies and the elites have their own patronage systems of these state trading companies. And this two-tier economy, I think, has implications because if we're mistakenly analyzing one and coming up with policy prescriptions for the other, it's like a doctor making an incorrect diagnosis. And so I think moving again away from the ideological component and more of trying to think of a three-stage approach to North Korea. Diagnose what's happening, think about policy recommendations, and monitor. If we continue to do that, I think we have a fighting chance in trying to better understand these transformations happening in North Korea. And one final point related to Ian's paper, as this informal activity is going on, it also gives us an insight into the 21,000 defectors in South Korea. That's a ballpark figure. There are others who claim that the size of the defector community in South Korea now is much larger. But essentially, they came over in three waves. One was the Kim Dae-jung period, where essentially a lot of them were economic migrants. The second group, those who were in trouble politically with the regime. And the third group, those who had the means, they made enough money through the informal market activity that they bought their way to South Korea. These three generations, I think, also show and reflect the changes and the transformations that have happened in North Korea. Very similar to cutting off a tree and looking at the rings of a tree. The defector community is interesting in that perspective. But the third generation is the most dynamic because the common perception and common reports that we hear are that North Korean defectors in general have a hard time assimilating to South Korean society, making a living, holding down a job, and so forth. That certainly, I think, pertains to the, relates to the first two generations. But the third generation is still engaged in a lot of commercial activity with their former associates in the border region. So it paints a very different picture of what's happening in North Korea. Moving to Peter's paper, to me, the key point of why cell phones won't lead to revolution and how they strengthen the regime. To draw on this theme of a two-tier economy, I think cell phones a good way to show how, like a young senator giving a speech in Boston of the two Americas, in North Korea there are two North Koreas. And in many respects, it's the haves and the have-nots. The haves have the Orascom cell phones. Those are the higher-end 3G, very expensive, tightly controlled, tightly regulated cell phones. They're the status symbols in Pyongyang and other major cities in North Korea. The have-nots are the ones who have the SIM card cheap Chinese mobile phones that are used in the border area. Those are tolerated. And the interesting thing about these cell phones is that it gives a reflection on the user, the owner of the cell phones. One of the key things about the Chinese cell phones is that we hear about these restrictions. Every so often in the border area, there will be a North Korean government announcement that everyone has to turn in their contraband Chinese mobile phones. But then you have to ask why. Why are there so many restrictions and regulations along the border? And I'm not saying that this is the only explanation, but one thing that's interesting is that for every restriction, there's a bribe. And so if you restrict Chinese mobile phones and a border official or a guard official finds a Chinese mobile phone on you, that empowers that official to excise a fine. And essentially in their world, that fine is very important for that individual's family, for feeding that family, for operational budget. There are many aspects to this behavior where it goes back to this interconnected aspect with the informal markets, but we can see some interesting characterizations through the different usage of different types of mobile phones. But this leads to my characterization. If I were to look at the Orascom and the cheap Chinese mobile phones and ask the question, which is having the greater impact on transformations inside North Korea, I would say the cheap Chinese phones. And the reason why is that if you look at the informal markets, the flow of goods have been continuing since the tragedy of the Great Famine and when these informal markets were a survival mechanism. But over the years, as it became a coping mechanism, information flow was a very important thing for figuring out what the price of certain commodities were, making transactions, setting up the terms, going into China, procuring, selling in North Korea, and so forth. But the interesting thing with this activity is also on the back of the flow of goods also comes the flow of information. And so the information flow about the outside world, as a lot of these third-generation defectors in South Korea point out, in the border area, what's happening on the outside world is not a mystery. It's just that it's deprioritized. It's really about the transaction, and that's where the majority of the attention is focused. But in a very specific sense, the role of Chinese mobile phones is important because it's absolutely critical in facilitating the flow of remittances. As I mentioned, the ballpark figure of 21,000 defectors in South Korea, over 70% of them come from North Hamgyong province. So that's a very small district in proportion to the rest of North Korea. So if you look at the flow of money going to these relatives, that's a disproportionate impact, although on a countrywide basis it may be quite marginal. And with this, the Chinese mobile phones, before the wider usage of Chinese mobile phones, sending money back to your relative would take anywhere from days to weeks. And if you were to send $100 a month, as an example, 25 to 30% of that would be deducted on both sides of the border by human couriers. With the advent of, with the greater usage of Chinese mobile phones, the rates have come down to about 15% on both sides. But whereas it took days or weeks, now it takes 15 minutes. So the usage of Chinese mobile phones, that I think is perhaps the biggest under-examined impact on local political economy, the changing relationship between average North Korean citizens and officials, and the broader growth of the informal markets. Now, looking at some of the policy implications, the greater use of both types of cell phones offer interesting opportunities. The Orascom network is tightly controlled, and as Peter pointed out, the latest software technology is used to monitor different speech. But with different networks, I think, comes the opportunity, in addition, as Peter mentioned, the opportunity to jam some frequencies. I think in other areas, apologies, he was mentioning information and contingencies. Another is to send accurate information. In the situation where there's intense competition between state trading companies and individuals, if accurate information about estimates of their wealth, their ownership of certain state trading companies, monopolies, if that information got out, I think there would be an interesting relationship, an equilibrium that would be underway in terms of the elites in North Korea. And certainly an outside way to try to shape some of the environment as this leadership succession process is happening. And moving to the last paper, to Jane's paper, I learned a lot in this paper, and this is something that cyber and cybersecurity, anything related to cyber right now, is truly the cutting edge. In this, colleagues who focus on Asia and specifically China, we always joke, why are there never reports of US cyber attacks against Chinese installations? Why is it always question marks about, was it China that attacked this US company or this US government agency? And then yesterday I read a report that in reaction to the report that came out of McAfee, an internet security company, that a nation state had been behind 5 years of coordinated cyber attacks. In response to that, there was a Chinese statement that they themselves have been the target of attacks. Whether that's genuine or not, it's hard to see, but it leads to this whole question of the relationship between Chinese capabilities and North Korean capabilities. And here I venture on territory that I don't cover regularly, but anecdotally hearing that some of the more sophisticated North Korean labs are situated in northeastern China. And so the relationship between the cyber infrastructure on the Chinese side as a force multiplier for North Korean capabilities, we see that in one area of cyber warfare. But when it comes to cyber profits and e-commerce, I'd be interested in the websites that Jane put up if there were Chinese versions of those, because one thing that pre-exists the greater use of cyber capabilities, more and more North Korean trade investment delegations visiting key Chinese cities to drum up investments. These are very arduous, they're not particularly professional, but imagine if they had a website that they could send the address to. And as Jane mentioned, I think there's a very important opportunity with marketing. If you can do sophisticated marketing to the point where you're empowering potential investors with information, and that leads to a phone call or something that leads further down the lines in terms of a site visit and so forth, that is a huge improvement on these trade and investment delegations where they would rent out a cheap hotel banquet facility and give a presentation that really was subpar. Looking at some of the implications here, I'm struck how within the United States, and this is really not only the purview of government but corporations, with access to internet viewing patterns, as you've all experienced if you've shopped on Amazon a few times, you get emails with things like, wow, I'd be really interested in buying that. If you can harvest some of the viewing patterns out of some of these cyber sites on.
Thank you very much for all very interesting presentations. I have a couple of related questions for Mr. Nesbitt. You talked about who would be benefiting or who would be using these phones. And it wasn't clear to me if it was sort of conjectural or based on some policy statement that you're using as a source, or based on actual observation of who has the phones currently. Specifically the people in the informal markets, who I would think maybe are outside the periphery or not part of the elite. In contrast, Mr. Park seemed to be suggesting that those people, if they have cell phones, they're probably the Chinese cell phones. And then related to that, just out of curiosity too, you mentioned people visiting the country. Would they be just coming in with their SIM cards, or would they actually be allowed to come in with their own cell phones and be charged exorbitant roaming fees, as happens in most other places?
No. All right. For the first, in terms of the sources of who's using these, they're partially conjectural in terms of who needs a benefit for this policy to go forward in the first place, and also based off of understanding of how cell phones are used in any culture, in any society. Also, in terms of the military and elite, that was already referenced in terms of who are the main users for the RASCOM cell phones. And in terms of actual for the current Chinese cell phone owners, those traders, the new rich, that was, again, if you look towards their desire to appear, closer to the old money, to appear like the societal wealth, that'll provide future growth opportunities for RASCOM in terms of who they're selling to. But that was just in terms of who are the potential stakeholders. In terms of the actual visitors, at least from my understanding from the few articles about how the 3G technology is, the WCMA technology that RASCOM's providing, it's very similar to some other countries' technology, so it depends on your cell phone. But my guess, they're doing that so they can force foreign companies or foreign NGOs to actually purchase a certain number of cell phones and pay monthly contract fees. I think right now the going rate was, I think, a $2,000 activation fee plus a few $100s a month for a simple service.
Okay. Bill?
Hi, I'm Bill Newcomb. 3 very interesting papers, 4 great presentations. And if I could just address a quick question, comment to each of the 3 presenters. First, I thought John's comment on Mr. Reinhardt's paper about the need to look at the different economies of North Korea was very much on point, because I think you have to look at the interaction of those in order to look at motivations and impediments to reform. My other comment is, when you addressed the military, and you said you were you had some questions about the military, you looked at the military as an institution. You might also want to look at the military as a budget category. If the military accounts for, say, 1/3 of the on-budget and off-budget expenditures, you can't really reform the economy unless you reallocate resources. And if you're going to continue to follow a military-first policy, you can't reallocate resources, so reform becomes a topic of discussion, but not an actual policy that could be followed and implemented. Second, on Mr. Nesbitt, I've got a couple of questions for you. From North Korea's point of view, why a ROSCOM and not reinvigorate and recontract with Loxley? I mean, they had a very warm, rich relationship with Thaksin, who actually had, the Loxley company. So why a ROSCOM? And from the point of, if I just may finish, from the point of view of a ROSCOM, why North Korea and not some other market? And does the ROSCOM always create a bank in countries where it goes and sets up a cell phone network? And then finally, I've seen Ms. Kim before and really enjoyed her paper before. And I have a quick question for you. What about online gambling? How much of a profit center is that? How involved is North Korea in that? I mean, I've read that Stanley Ho, the gambling magnate of Macau, makes more from online gambling than he does from his Macau casinos. So that could be a pretty good profit center. And in terms of North Korea cyber commerce, how are the payments being handled? So thank you very much.
Good questions, Bill. Let's turn it first to Ian.
Oh, sure. Well, I didn't see a question mark, but those are very, very useful comments, and I hope to incorporate those when the papers are published in the fall.
First, why a RASCOM rather than Loxley Pacific? First, I think it was partially the technology itself is different. I think the 3G technology is much harder to decrypt and harder to collect on from, let's say, a foreign intelligence agency collection standpoint, which is the whole point of why when South Korea, during the Sunshine Policy, tried to approach selling a CDMA version to North Korea or have it in that trade site, the United States blocked it because we had the patent at the time. Well, this new WCDMA 3G technology that RASCOM's selling doesn't have a U.S. patent, so there's no way for us to block that rollout of that technology. Second, one thing that Loxley could not provide, what a RASCOM can, is a whole lot of funding to other areas. As I mentioned, the Sangwon cement plant, the finishing of the iconic hotel in Pyongyang. Why they are rolling out a bank, I think that's partially because they mentioned, I think it was in their annual report, of the difficulty for doing payments within North Korea because their rudimentary banking system. So they actually have to create the bank in order for them to process the payments in the first place. And so why North Korea for them? One of the sons, the Sararis, is actually a family-owned conglomerate in Egypt. He's made his career basically within the telecom industry by going to the most dangerous, difficult places in the world. He went to Iraq in 2003 and set up their first cell phone network. and made, I think he said, a 10,000% return on his initial investment. So he was, in 2008, this is, again, another story about him. I think it was in Business Week or one of the other business journals. He's like, which countries do not have cell phone service right now, and which countries do people not want to provide cell phone service? And that's where he went. And yeah, I think that answers the gist of the questions.
Okay, good.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Park, for your comments. Those are aspects I didn't really think about before, and I'll try to incorporate into my paper. As far as, hello, Mr. Newcomb. The questions that you asked, as far as online gambling, there wasn't anything of a technical nature that I read that really reported on that. I did read a couple saying that there were instances where North Korean hackers worked in some sort of online gaming situation to swindle money. But other than that, I'm not quite sure of the impact or the profits. I can't speak on that. And as far as the cyber commerce, like the Korean Friendship Association, for example, when I looked, their payments were made through an organization in Thailand, and I'm not quite sure how from there it's, you know, sent back to North Korea. I'm sure it is, but in what capacity, I'm not quite sure. Didn't really research into that, but maybe that's something I can look into as well. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Are there other questions? Go ahead, Chris. Microphone's on its way.
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thanks for 3 terrific papers. I have to say, I think old farts like Jack and I are used to thinking of John Park as the young rising generation, and it's a sobering thing to realize, oh my God, you're not anymore, which means we're even older than we were. So thank you.
For yourself.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. You know, Jack, people like Jack, we spend our days on the policy stuff, and as you guys were doing these terrific papers and doing your research, did you find yourselves resisting the urge to say, you know, all the reforms that we want to have happen in North Korea, we don't even have an intersection up there to have diplomats, you know, wandering around shaking hands. We don't have any business guys allowed to go for obvious reasons, maybe. Did you find yourselves sort of frustrated at the disconnect between what we all sort of would like to see happening in North Korea and what we're able to do about it right now? Which I realize isn't the topic of your papers, but you know, you guys are going to be handling Korea policy all your professional lives, perhaps. So I'd be interested in your sense of how you see the policy and maybe some of the disconnects. Thanks.
Anyone like to take that?
Well, I can start. I think your question speaks to the first contradiction I raised, which is the ability of the U.S. to support any kind of organization, civil society organization up front without discrediting it. So in that sense, the lack of a U.S. embassy in Pyongyang, I think, probably doesn't hurt as much as one might think, because if the embassy, you know, we had political officers out there shaking hands, well, you know, that's going to create problems. So speaking just about my policy recommendations, since they're on the more of the soft power side, things we can do through NGOs, things like that, it doesn't necessarily handicap us to not have that business or political presence.
And I think if you look at the other extreme, would be China, for example. You know, obviously a strong historical and political ties in lots of ways, and also business ties as well. But despite all these ties, the Chinese have a very, very hard time getting North Koreans to do anything they want, especially on the business front. And that was like the number one complaint by the Chinese businessmen, is that they didn't have access to cell phones for like 10 years. They had it in China. It's very, very difficult for them to, you know, enter in contracts. They feel that they're going to be safe, you know, from actually, you know, receiving the goods they're, you know, paying for. So even for the multi-level diplomacy that goes on from the Chinese perspective, whether they be businesses, other, you know, non-government entities, and at government levels, they still haven't made as much headway as I think they'd like to make as well.
And for me, I mean, while I was doing my research, I relied heavily on Korean material as well as English material. But as far as the policy regarding North Korea's internet, you know, advancements or endeavors, I couldn't really find anything that was public. And so I guess if there's a frustration, that would be it. That there's very little that's available to the public as these things unfold.
And so hopefully in the future that's something that could be worked on.
Okay, terrific. Any last questions we have from the audience? Well, please.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Laura Rodriguez with CRDF Global. And thank you all for some very interesting presentations. I learned so much this afternoon. And my question is to all of the panelists. What do you think about the imminent change of power that is going to happen, and how will that affect what you have discussed in your topics in the upcoming years?
No particular order, whoever wants to jump in there.
Sure, okay, I'll start. I mean, as I mentioned, I think with the succession, there is a need for some sort of legitimizing factor. And I think this huge technological advancement, be it the internet or a wide-ranging intranet, is actually something that to the outsider or even to North Koreans could appear to be a great accomplishment that Kim Jong-un achieved. And so for me, I think that as far as the internet and intranet within North Korea can actually be something that's supportive or supports the regime change, actually.
And I think as long as the cost-benefit analysis is the same in terms of cell phones, in terms of the level of control, and the real economic gains and social gains and economic good gains you can get from providing cell phones, as long as that equation still stays in balance, I think even with the regime change, that should stay. That would still stay in effect.
And a lot of people talk about the need for stability and continuity as this process unfolds. You have this sort of regency of Kim Jong-il's sister and brother-in-law who are looking after affairs in connection with him and hoping to continue policies forward with Kim Jong-un, according to what I've read. So I would expect very little change in the near future. However, talking about economic reform down the road, you're just one generation further removed from Kim Il-sung, which I think opens up space to bring in new ideas, and there's just a less intimate connection to the policies of the past. And this is years down the road, once I feel Kim Jong-un has an ability to establish himself. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying that I think there's more space there for the possibility of economic reform.
All right, well, let me wrap things up first by thanking Dr. John Park for stimulating the discussion and providing his views as well. And as we mentioned, these papers were recommended by professors, so our thanks do go out to Dr. Victor Cha and Catherine Weathersby for their terrific recommendations. Thirdly, as I mentioned, the papers are going to be published, so the comments that you've made today will give the authors an opportunity to tweak the papers a little bit, to make them slightly better, but they're awfully good now. And thirdly, let me remind you that this is the first of 3 parts of this Emerging Voices Symposium series that we put together. The next one will be on Wednesday, August 17th, and I hope you join us for that as well. But lastly, and most importantly, I think we've seen by demonstration for 3 terrific papers and 3 terrific presenters that the Korea and U.S.-Korea policy is in good hands. The upcoming generation has done a terrific job, and we at KEI are just absolutely pleased to have been able to sponsor this, and I hope you join us for the continuation of this. And so if you'll join me in thanking our presenters one last time, we'll conclude our day's activities. Thank you.